Gary having visited with a host of new acquaintance on ICQ, a lady in Celina, sparking Gary's interest, conveying she owned a ranch, raised horses, and in addition, owned a bail bond business. Gary was intrigued, but not enough to make the drive, the two agreeing to meet in Wichita for lunch on Saturday. His new acquaintance-to-be, Sally, arriving in a new Cadillac, the two entertaining lunch at a Carlos O'Kelly's Mexican restaurant. The afternoon finding the couple exploring the realm of Old Town, discovering the lady was very familiar with it, knowing the location of several thrift stores, explaining, "This is where she did her bargain hunting when down this way." The Saturday afternoon coming to a conclusion, the lady extending an invitation to meet again, only this time in Celina. Gary acknowledging he would have to reference the ambulance schedule and get back with her, but it was already questionable, having doubts about driving over 3 hours to acquaint someone for lunch, let alone start a 170-mile driving distance relationship. The following morning, Gary awakened with excruciating abdominal pain, at first attributing it to the Mexican food he had consumed Saturday afternoon, but the intensity of pain was increasing, realizing it was something serious. Deciding to drive the short distance to the hospital. Entering, he was greeted by a questioning RN, Patty McNamar. Gary briefly explaining his condition, Patty immediately notifying the on-call physician. Dr. Sid arriving, hesitant of making a diagnosis after Gary related, he had no appendix, and Dr. Ransom had recently done a colonoscopy, and all looked well. Dr. Sid placing a call to Dr. Ransom in Medicine Lodge, asking the surgeon if it might be best for him to come in. Dr. Ransom suggesting, because of the severity of the pain, Gary should be immediately transported to Pratt Medical Center for a CT scan. Dr. Sid telling Patty to notify the ambulance, but before she could, Gary stopping her, noticing that Bob, the newly acquired lab tech, who resided in the same price apartments that Gary did, just happened to be at the hospital. Gary asking Bob if he would drive him to Pratt in the Buick if he promised not to die on the way. Bob agreeing. The medical center emergency room staff having been notified. With his arrival, the pain just about incapacitating, Bob assisting Gary, the hospital staff immediately readying a CT scan. The last Gary remembered was a requirement to drink several glasses of some liquid before entering the scan. Awakening 3 days later in ICU, the first thing he noticed was the subcubical IVs, knowing their meaning from experience. Subcubical IV position was used for major surgical procedures, but more often used for those with a life-threatening prognosis. Removed from ICU to the surgical recovery floor, the performing surgeon approaching Gary, welcoming him back to the real world, explaining that he had an acute colon rupture, and he performed a conventional surgical colectomy. The surgical procedure entailed opening his lower cavity, abstracting his colon and surgically removing 27 inches of the damaged area, doing a complete cavity cleansing so he would be free of any peritonitis infection. Gary, somewhat concerned, having difficulty breathing, the surgical anesthesiologist when visiting, remarked it was the result of an adverse reaction to the anesthesia, the main reason for the time spent in ICU. Then adding, "You may not survive its use in another operation." During his stay in the hospital, Gary having just 2 visits, Bob the lab tech, and 2 members of the Apostolic Christian Church, Huber and Tom Farney. After 8 days in the hospital he was getting restless, the doctors still not wanting to release him, but as a hospital employee, he knew the secret of how to extract an exit. Walking the halls, spending time at the nurse's station, knowing they would convey this to the doctor, and it wasn't long, his release was assured. The timing was right, Gary placing a call to the Kiowa hospital at afternoon shift change time. RN Debbie Duval answering. Gary asking if she could talk someone into picking him up at the Pratt hospital, Debbie replying, she was on her way. With the return home, Gary's having two difficulty. The first was the irritation of the stitches and staples, the second was one of more consequence, bowel control. His colon presented some conflict when Mother Nature called. The good news was that as time passed the control problem would too. Gary having a question for Dr. Ransom. How come the colon problem wasn't noticed during his colonoscopy procedure? Dr. Ransom replied, the colonoscopy views the inside of the colon, not the outside.